Let's get the show on the road. Quick 10-minute game, quick and easy. 2289. Okay, excellent. So joined a long time ago, so looks like we're in for a good game. Good luck to chess player 560123, and we are facing an Alapin from the black side. I've recommended a couple of different systems with black. I've kind of vacillated on what to make my kind of official recommendation. I feel like going d5 and knight f6. Let's go for this line. This is what I've been playing lately in my own blitz games, and it's a pretty solid line. Okay, so our opponent plays d4, we play c takes d4. Yeah, so the way our opponent plays it just kind of gives us a pretty favorable IQP structure. This is possible from the white side, but it's not particularly ambitious. If white plays knight f3, believe it or not, this is actually a transposition to a Caro-Kann Panov attack. Like, this position can occur via the Caro-Kann move order, as I'll show after the game. The obvious move here is bishop g4, but bishop g4 leads to a very forced line where white responds with queen b3 typically. There's a bunch of trades, and then the position liquidates into an equal endgame. So the downside of playing this line with black is there are a couple of these very drawish lines that white can play to neutralize the knight f6 Alapin. We're going to go e6. We're going to keep fire on the board, and we're going to keep some action alive. e6 is an alternative. The downside of this move is obviously that the bishop on c8 is kept outside of the pawn chain. The upside is that we keep the queens on the board, and here we get a very kind of classical IQP struggle. I've had a couple of positions on both sides of the isolated queen pawn throughout the speedruns, and here we are facing the isolated queen pawn, and we have a relatively favorable setup in the sense that we have complete control of the square in front of the pawn. This is kind of the golden rule when you're trying to assess an IQP position. First thing you look for is who has control of the square in front of the IQP. If it's the side that's fighting it, then this pawn is relatively immobilized, and it's harder to shoot at a moving target than a stationary target. Okay, so the second step toward consolidating our positional advantage is probably to find suitable arrangement for the bishop on c8. And we don't have much of a choice because we have a pawn on e6. Knight e4 is a bit of a weird move. I'm not really sure what our opponent wants. So we're going to follow through on our plan with b6. And if we can fianchetto the bishop and maybe even get a rook to c8, we kind of reach an ideal setup. White's got to do something relatively fast. If he doesn't, then we develop all of our pieces. And if we can stabilize the knight on d5, we have a great version of the IQP structure. Now, our opponent is now thinking, I think some of you watching are probably worried about like knight g5. Ooh, scary. But we can just respond with h6. I'm not sure what the follow-up is. This knight on e4 may look intimidating, and the prospect of knight g5 may look scary, but there's nothing concrete. In order to generate concrete threats, white probably has to build a battery out of the bishop and the queen. And if you know anything about IQP structures, then you probably know that one of white's most typical plans is to pile up against the h7 pawn by constructing a battery. And when you construct a battery, you generally want the queen as the leading piece because you want to threaten checkmate. So the typical way of doing it is to drop the bishop back to c2 and then to have the queen take the bishop's place with queen d3. But white has already lost a little bit too much time to make this happen. If white plays bishop c2, first of all, we can play bishop a6, and we can take away the d3 square. Second of all, even if we let white play bishop c2 and queen d3, we can simply meet that with the move knight c to b4, completely disarming the battery. So it's a very cumbersome plan. It takes like 3 moves typically to set up the battery. And even if white does, it's not like the game ends immediately. We can always play g6, and we can blunt the effect of the bishop and the queen. Royal Fork, Rumble, thank you for the subs. Hopefully this makes a certain degree of sense. I'm not going to go from like the very basics because I've had a couple of IQP games already. And remember that the basic philosophy of the speedrun is that I tend to match my in-game observations to the current level that I'm at. If you're watching this and you're a relatively newer player, you might not be as familiar with IQP positions, and that's okay. Just try to follow the game. Don't worry too much about knowing all the typical plans and ideas. Okay, knight g5. So our opponent kind of says, all right, well, I already put my knight on e4, I might as well. Okay, we can play g6 here, but I mean, obviously the benefit of h6 is that it's a tempo move, and we're gaining more time. Time that we can use to complete our development and start putting pressure on the d4 pawn. It feels like our opponent is kind of losing the thread of the game already. He might not be too familiar with IQP structures. Yeah, h7 is no longer a target. That's true, but the h7 square is still a target. The point is not that there's a pawn on h7. Even if there was a zebra on h7, white would still try to target that square. But by the time, I mean, white doesn't even have the time to drop the bishop back anymore, because currently the knight is hanging. It's not totally clear where to put the knight. Knight h7 is probably asking for trouble, so our opponent goes all the way back to e4. Okay, so we don't have to think too long. We can complete our development with bishop b7. I think it would be a mistake for us to push f5. Maybe some of you are like, all right, let's go. Let's follow up on our previous move. But f5 is a very weakening move. The knight on e4 is not bothering us. In fact, it's kind of in the middle of white's pieces. It's actually hurting white more than it's hurting us. So f5 would merely create an additional unnecessary target on e6. Okay, so now we enter the phase where we kind of make small, slow, improving moves, and we take eventual steps towards surrounding and winning the isolated queen pawn. But this process is a long one, it's a gradual one, and we're not out of useful improving moves just yet. So a move that we could throw in without thinking much is rook to c8. We can just bring the rook to the open file. This is a very flexible move. We're not doing anything concrete just yet. In some cases, we're setting up ideas like knight b4, but above all, we're just getting the rook to an open file. Our queen can remain on its initial square for the time being, because in the future, we might actually take the knight away from d5, and the queen will be directly aiming at the biggest target in white's position, which of course is the pawn on d4. Now, what you should understand about blockades, right, is that the point of a blockade is to immobilize the target. But eventually, the knight is going to move away from d5. This is a temporary post. Eventually, we're going to want to win the d4 pawn. The point, as I think Larson put it, is a blockade is not like an end in itself. It's a means to an end. You blockade a pawn a lot of the time in order to eventually win the pawn. Okay, knight g3. So there's a couple of things that come to mind here. We can go knight c to b4, but then white will drop the bishop back to b1. So if we're playing that move, we need a clear follow-up. I actually have a follow-up in mind. This is an idea that I have seen before, so I'm not generating this on my own. We're going to go knight c to b4, and we're going to try to put a knight on c2. And the point of trying to put a knight on c2 is not to fork the two rooks, because anytime a knight appears on c2, white's going to be able to take it with the bishop. But what is white's main attacking engine? What is white's main attacking piece? It is, in fact, the bishop on b1. Without this bishop, white is not going to be able to build a battery. White is not going to be able to do anything to harass our king in any way. So we need to add an attacker to the c2 square. Well, if I put it like that, then the move is obviously queen c7. And the crazy thing is that white is so pushed back to the first rank that white has a very hard time stopping the infiltration of the knight on c2. And white cannot play rook e2. Or actually, white can play rook e2. I missed that. Amazingly, white actually can play rook e2 because queen takes c1, there is a check on h7. But rook e2 is also a very awkward move. So we can play bishop a6, for instance, and white is already like borderline losing. White has to contort himself massively to avoid losing material. Yeah, so rook e2 is viable, but it doesn't solve all of white's problems. And allowing knight c2 is pretty disastrous from a positional standpoint as well. Probably I would play rook e2 here. Yeah, knight h5. Our opponent is throwing himself onto our king. Does this alter our plans in any way? Not really. Very important to understand, a lot of newer players, they see a move like this, and then they kind of instinctively, they want to react by pushing the piece away like g6. But I would hesitate to make any unnecessary weaknesses, and I would always ask, like, is the piece actually doing anything? Is it causing us direct discomfort? Now, you might say, well, what about a sack on g7? Well, none of this can possibly work because white's got essentially no pieces on the king side. Of course, maybe some of it will work, but it's very unlikely. So we follow up on our plan with knight c2. You don't always need to react defensively to moves like this. You can follow through on your plan. I think our plan is much stronger than whatever it is that white is doing on the king side. This takes a certain degree of guts, but it's like white's got nothing going on the king side. And if white plays bishop takes c2, we take with a queen and we force a queen trade, which is also in our favor. Then we really won't have to worry about anything that happens on the king side. And then we're essentially positionally winning, I think. If white has to take on c2, we're positionally winning. So my guess is our opponent is thinking about various sacrifices, desperation ideas, but nothing is going to work. Yeah, another very important detail some of you might be noticing is that if white plays queen d3 and says, aha, your ass is mine because the knight can't move because if there's mate on h7, queen d3, no, white's ass is actually ours because of knight d to b4, forcing the queen away from the diagonal. Okay, there we go. So as we predicted, white is going to just put on one last desperation attempt. And this type of Hail Mary chess can be really dangerous, especially if it's orchestrated by good players. We need to be ballsy, we need to be firm, but we also shouldn't be too arrogant and just grab all of the pieces that are offered to us. The first question is, what do we take? Which can be a very infuriatingly hard question to answer. Now, my instinct is to play g takes h6 because the rooks are not really going anywhere. We're not worried about bishop takes c2. What could be white's idea after gh? Well, probably it's to play queen to d2, would be my guess, and then to send the queen down to h6. And that would be genuinely very, very dangerous. So give me a second to figure this out. Takes, okay, I think I see a defense. I think we start with g takes h6. And often what tends to happen is when your opponent throws his pieces at you, you need to do a little bit of calculation. You need to be very concrete because at times there's no safe option. You have to open up your king. It's scary for 2 or 3 moves, but once you repel the initiative, it's over. So here, for instance, I think we have a very strong move that might not be intuitive to people who are super worried about queen takes h6. You might be thinking, oh, black is busted, we should go king h7. But king h7 is a really inadvisable move. It self-pins the knight. You might say, oh, well, what about bishop g5? And bishop g5 is a very sound idea, except it runs into knight takes g5. And I think that's a possible course of action. You might say, oh, bishop g5, knight takes g5, great. White's no longer threatening the h-pawn, let's take the rook, but that's a little bit too messy. I think the key to the position is actually, unless I'm blundering something, to play knight takes e1. And it's reliant on a very important tactic. If white plays queen takes h6, who can spot the winning sequence? It's not very hard if this move is already played on the board. But this is what I'm talking about. You have to often find a 2 or 3 move defensive sequence, and then the attack is completely shut down. Yeah, we play knight takes f3 check, g takes f3, and the queen moves up to c1. Again, the c file is what decides the game. Right? When I played rook c8, did I see this when I played rook c8? No, but this is why you need to occupy open files with your heavy pieces, because of stuff like this. Yeah, queen h6, knight f3, g f3, queen c1 check, and we're forcing the queen trade. We're forcing the queen trade. And it's a check, most importantly. If it wasn't a check, white would have mate on g7, but it would also succumb to bishop h7 check. Now, if white recaptures on e1 with his knight, then we can already play bishop g5. So for instance, in this position, we would not want to go queen c1 and blunder bishop h7 check. We would go bishop g5, and the attack is over. Queen d3, we can go f5, and that's it. We're up a full rook. And our opponent is coming to terms with that right now. He's got 30 seconds, so it's over. Okay, queen h6, he goes down the line, and queen c1 check will lead to resignation. GG, yeah, good game, short game, but I think a pretty instructive game nonetheless. A lot of people think that the side which has the isolated queen pawn has all the fun, and that's not necessarily the case. It can be very, very dangerous to play with an isolated queen pawn if you don't know the typical plans and you don't know how to arrange your pieces. You can often get crushed in a manner similar to this one. So there's a lot that I could talk about in the general context of IQP positions. I'm not going to give you a 3-hour lecture on typical ideas in the isolated queen pawn. I'm going to limit myself to some relatively basic observations. I'm sure there are other IQP games that you could look at in the speedrun. I don't remember them offhand. We have talked a lot about this particular anti-Alapin setup with d5, e takes d5, knight f6. We faced it from the white side, and in my opinion, white has 2 good moves. White's 2 good moves are queen a4 check and bishop b5 check. Both of these moves are aimed at making it difficult for black to recapture the d5 pawn. You could find a theoretical exposition of this elsewhere, but suffice it to say in this video that bishop b5 check and queen a4 check are both excellent moves that do give white, I think, a slight advantage with best play by both sides. So our opponent plays d4, which is fine. C takes c4, C takes c4. Our opponent goes for a very straightforward continuation. And I mentioned, after we had both developed our knights, I mentioned that this could transpose into a Caro-Kann. What do I mean by that? Well, Caro-Kann goes e4, c6, d4, d5, and now the Panov attack is e takes d5, c takes d5, and c4, and you can kind of see the contours of the IQP structure already crystallizing. Now black typically plays knight f6, white typically goes knight c3, knight c6, and if white plays knight f3, the main move for black is bishop g4. If black plays e6, which is the second most popular move, here white can play c takes d5, knight takes d5, and voila, we've transposed to the game. All right, via a Caro-Kann. Seemingly completely different opening, but that's the magic of chess. Two Caro-Kann and Sicilian can transpose into each other under the right circumstances. By the way, this position can also be reached via a Nimzo-Indian move order, which might be even crazier to you. But you can get IQP positions also from a Rubinstein variation. White can play like this. And for example, not an exact transposition, but you can get this type of structure in one of the main lines of the Rubinstein variation. d5, bishop d3, c5. This is like the typical pawn cube. For example, knight f3, castles, castles. And already if black wants, the main move is knight c6. But if black wants, he can get an isolated queen pawn structure. Boom. There you go. Here's another version of an IQP structure. So IQPs can arise out of a variety of different openings. Chances are that you have somewhere in your opening repertoire where you're either playing against an isolated queen pawn or you're playing with an isolated queen pawn. The other most popular misconception is people ask, like, is the IQP good or bad? It depends entirely on the type of position that you get. Generally, it's dynamically balanced, like both sides have their chances in a lot of IQP positions, but largely it depends on where the pieces are placed, which side is more active, and the other factors in the position. You can't make a judgment call on whether the IQP is good or bad. It's a meaningless question. Going back to the game, as I mentioned, if we play bishop g4, this transposes directly into the main line of the Panov. If black plays bishop g4 here, this is the Caro-Kann move order. White plays c takes d5, knight takes d5, and the annoying move is queen to b3, which leads to essentially a forced drawing line. Black plays bishop f3, white plays g takes f3, e6, queen takes b7. This is not that important. At the end of this forcing line, the queens are traded, the knights are traded, and you get this very interesting endgame, which has occurred thousands of times and is incredibly well studied. And it's very well known that the position is equal. Now it's actually black who has an isolated queen pawn. White's got the damaged pawn structure on the king side, but black is experiencing long-term problems with king safety, because once white plays bishop e3 and castles queenside, it's not entirely clear where black should hide the king. If you put it on the e-file, well, white's going to get a rook to e1. If you put it on the c-file, similarly, white can easily get a rook to c1. So white has the easier access to open files. That's why black typically gives a check on b4 and quickly tries to get his own rooks to the important open files. But this is considered to be dead equal. Most games that enter this line end in a draw. And I didn't want to get this endgame. I assumed that my opponent knows it pretty well. Which is why, in this position, I decided to play the more traditional isolated queen pawn move, which is e6. Okay, hopefully that explanation made some sense. All right, so bishop d3 is very standard. This is where typically the bishop is developed. Bishop e7, castles, castles. And this position has occurred well over 1,000 times from many different openings. Over 5,000 times in my database. On Drake and Serrano, like almost all the top players have had this position with one side or the other. And knight e4 is not a very good move. I think this is already a major step in the wrong direction. White is displaying a fundamental lack of knowledge of how to play these positions. You do not want to leave the knight on d5 alone. If you leave this knight alone, then black is just completely fine. So the main move here is rook to e1. The main move here is rook to e1, which is just kind of a flexible improving move. Black is waiting. White is waiting for black to put his cards on the table, but there is a concrete idea. This is prophylactic. You are defending against the move b6. Who can tell me why? Why is b6 now an inadvisable move for black? This can be hard to figure out if you're not familiar with this type of position, but see if you can figure this out on your own. White to play and get a big advantage. It's not game over, but it's an advantage for white. Yeah, so exactly. So knight takes d5, queen takes d5, which is the way that you want to recapture. And now bishop e4 is incredibly unpleasant. This is the point of rook to e1. And suddenly black is just not in time. If you give black one more tempo, if we're able to play bishop b7, we're chilling. But here white is able to win material with knight e5, forcing black to take on e5, and this is just a clean extra exchange for white. So for that reason, black is forced to play e takes d5. But this also does not solve black's problems, because white can play queen to c2, forking the knight and the pawn on h7. Queen c2. You might say, oh, well, what about knight b4? But this does not work out tactically. Bishop h7, checking h1, queen b1. And if black plays g6, trapping the bishop, white sacks it on g6, which is actually very, very common. This is a very common way of dealing with the move g6. And white just gets a massive attack here. This is actually winning for white. Yeah, I still see two games in the database. Both of them, bishop f5, queen h5 check. Yeah, one guy played bishop h7. And here the best move is actually bishop g5, trying to clear space for the knight to jump into g5. So we could analyze this position, but the fact of the matter is that white has 3 pawns for a piece, and white has a long-lasting and massive attack on the king, with the rook coming into e5. There's too many big squares for black to hold on to. Okay, so you shouldn't be too concerned with this. The point is, rook e1 is a good move that prevents b6. So after rook e1, black's main move, there's a lot of moves here that GMs have played. The most popular move is bishop to f6, putting pressure on the d4 pawn. If white plays knight e4, which is the tempting move, black can actually play bishop takes d4. This works out for black. And we win the pawn. This is actually a very sharp line. White plays queen h5. The game continues. But black is considered to be fine here after h6. So for this reason, most people actually put the bishop on e4, adding more pressure to the knight on d5. This is the main move. Now, how do most GMs play here? Most popular move is knight c to e7, adding a defender to the knight. Now, typically, white plays queen to d3, building the battery. And this is not the best battery. It's preferable to have the queen in front of the bishop, but this is the next best thing because you are attacking h7 and you're provoking a weakness. If black plays g6, then this very seriously weakens the dark squares, obviously, around the king, and bishop h6 is a very unpleasant move to have to deal with. So most of the time, black goes h6, defending in a less weakening way. But now white can throw the knight onto e5. And white is getting very, very active. Black can play bishop d7, and the position is approximately equal. A lot of the time, what happens if both sides are demonstrating knowledge of how to play this properly, what often happens is that there's some sort of a big trade on d5, and it leads to some sort of an equal position. So knight c5, ed5, the structure has shifted from an IQP structure to symmetrical. Now white can play knight takes bishop, queen takes knight. By the way, d takes c4 would be a horrible blunder because this is a check. So no, you have to recapture on d7. White plays bishop f3, and maybe white is a tiny bit better because white's got the bishop pair. But on the other hand, the d4 pawn is a long-term target. Queen to f5, and the position is equal if black is accurate here. Okay, so this is just one of a million possible lines. Rook e1 is not forced. Bishop f6 is not forced. A lot of players, they go knight to f6 in this position. That's the second most popular move, just dropping the knight away and adding an attacker on the d4 pawn. But here I'm pretty sure white is considered to be slightly better. And the main move here is a3. This is a very old position. First occurred in the game Szabo Unziker 1954. And what's crazy is that the Szabo Unziker game, both of them were very strong European GMs of the 1950s. Laszlo Szabo from Hungary, Wolfgang Unziker from East Germany, or West Germany, I don't remember. No, I think West Germany. Big GM in the 50s and 60s. This game reached this position via the Nimzo-Indian move order. So just remember this position, hold it in your mind. The actual Unziker Szabo game went d4, knight f6, c4, e6. You're like, okay. And kind of how I demonstrated. Knight f3. No, sorry, queen's gambit declined. d5, knight c3, c5, semi-Tarrasch. Another opening that can yield IQP structures. cd, knight d5. Now, the main move here is e4, but Szabo played the more conservative line, e3, knight c6, bishop d3, cd, ed. There we go. The structure crystallizes, bishop e7, castles, castles, rook e1, knight f6, a3. There we go. So seemingly unrelated opening, and yet we get the same exact position. So how did that game continue? Szabo won that game. Let's take a look at the original game in this line. Unzicker played b6, which is totally reasonable. Now Szabo played. Actually, there's a game now earlier than Szabo and Unzicker. Najdorf had the white pieces, and British I am Harry Golombek had the black pieces. White won that game also. Another different opening. But in the Szabo Unzicker game, bishop g5, bishop b7. Now, what would you do here with white? Let's see who's been paying attention to my exposition of the typical plans and setups for white. How does white add pressure on black's position here? Like, what would you do here with white? Road to FM, got it. Bishop c2. Now it's time to execute the typical plan by rearranging the bishop and the queen. And incidentally, this is why the move a3 is played. So that once you complete the transformation, black does not have the move knight to b4, which actually I had in the game. That's why you put the pawn on a3. So Unzicker said, nope, I am not letting you put your queen on d3, but this is kind of an awkward move. Now the knight on c6 has lost a defender. So Szabo plays queen d2, connecting the rooks. Logical, rook c8 by Unzicker, also logical, kind of like the move I played in the game. Queen f4. I like this maneuver. The queen is probably sliding over to h4, adding an attacker to h7. And the problem that black experiences in a lot of these positions is that if you play h6 under the wrong circumstances, white will obviously play bishop h6. And this is just losing on the spot. Here, the knight on f6 temporarily holds the checkmate, but there's just nothing that black can do. White is just going to lift the rook up to e3 and then move the knight away and then mate you on g3. Okay, so this is what you need to be very careful about. Unzicker played rook e8. Now rook 81. Look how patiently Szabo is playing. Already black's position sucks. And this is actually a perfect illustrative game because black plays h6. Now bishop takes h6 was winning according to the engine, but Szabo plays a different line. He was a very positional player. He didn't like too many tactics. He plays bishop f6, bishop f6. And you might say, what is he doing giving away the dark squared bishop? But this is now the main idea of, or one of the main ideas of the side that has the isolated queen pawn. Under the right circumstances, you want to do what? And the circumstances are perfect for white to do this thing. What are we talking about? Yeah, d5. If white can push the IQP forward, it often leads to an explosion, and this explosion favors the side that has the more active pieces. Clearly, white has the more active pieces here, and d5 wins the game very quickly. Now, bishop c3, there's dc. Important detail. Now, both of these pieces are hanging. Queen f6, the line doesn't end. Queen f6. White to play. What do you do? How do you win the game here? Good little exercise. Not super tactical. Wow. Harry Golombek is a distant relative, somebody in the chat says. That's pretty incredible. Queen to e4. Very calm, sliding the queen to the battery square, and this is going to be forced mate. Very lovely forced mate. Rook to d7, mate in this line. So black loses the bishop on c3. So for this reason, Unzicker was forced to accept the trade. E takes d5. Now rook takes c8, rook takes queen takes c8, and Szabo plays queen to f5. Nasty little move. And a very instructive move. He actually does not recapture on d5. Most of you would play knight takes d5 here automatically, which is very unconvincing because black can play bishop takes b2 and it's anybody's game. But queen f5 is a good idea to remember. When there is a bishop on f6, a queen on f5 in conjunction with a bishop that bookends the battery is very powerful because black cannot go g6. And because black cannot go g6, he has to allow oftentimes a devastating check on h7. In the game, Unzicker played bishop c3, queen h7, king f8, bc, and white's attack is decisive. Knight e5, knight d4, lovely move, heading to f5. Knight g6, h4, top engine move by Szabo, trying to force the knight away from g6. so that you could deliver a check on e1. h5, bishop f5, rook takes e3, knight e6 check. This is GM level tactics here. F takes e6, bishop g6. Now, if queen e7, then queen h8 is mate. So black has to go to c6, check here, check here, rook e1, setting up a decisive check on e5. Bishop c8. Now Szabo simply grabbed the pawn on h5, and he won the game in a couple moves. Here, 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 just piling up on the pawn. Now he pushes his passer, and he won the game after here, here, here. And here, Unzucker resigned because the queens are traded and white promotes the h1. Now, I went very quickly through the second half of the game because it's not relevant to our conversation. It is obvious that white won the opening battle in that game. And there's a lot of model games that are shown to illustrate the power of this pawn push to d5. One game that was shown to me, and I saw this game in an old book on isolated queen pawn. Let me see if I can find it. It's De La Villa against Sion. So this game actually also came from an Alapin. And even if you don't play lines that involve isolated queen pawn, you shouldn't just like glaze over at this, because maybe one day you will, and it's just good to understand other structures, that even the ones that you don't play, because that's how you enrich. You can borrow ideas from a structure that you don't necessarily play, then that's how you become more well-rounded as a player. So this game actually started out as an Alapin, some sort of a weird line. Again, you got the IQP structure. And this game is pretty famous because white carried out an idea that also constitutes one of the sort of main ideas in IQP structures. Queen e2, bishop e7, rook d1, so all pretty standard stuff. And black plays a very bad move. Black voluntarily plays g6. Black voluntarily plays g6. This is a very weakening move. And white says to himself, oh, it would be very nice if we could now open up the center with d5. But obviously, you can't really go d5 immediately. Black just plays e takes d5. So white carries out a very famous maneuver that allows them to prepare d5. Who can tell me what white plays? So most of you are probably thinking, oh, let's go bishop c4 and prepare it with the bishop. And you have the right idea. But bishop c4 runs into the annoying move knight a5. Can we make a more flexible move? Yes, bishop to b1. The point is you're getting the bishop to a2, and that is how you're going to prepare d5. And if black goes knight a5 here, you can just go b4 and chase the knight back to c6. So in the game, this works to perfection because black just ignores the idea. White pushes d5. The trade happens, and black's position just collapses because black has too many weaknesses here, and white is way too active. Queen b8, bishop h6 is very strong, and black is already busted. Because no matter what black does, there's either going to be this checkmate or there's going to be something. Something is going to give here. Black plays knight d4 and just gives away a piece. Bishop f8, bishop b3, white won. A very kind of textbook game. And this is like one of the two main ideas on the white side of the IQP, which is to prepare d5. The other one is to attack the black king on the king side. Okay. So, of course, like I'm giving you model games from the white side, from the side that has the IQP. And I'm referring to it as the white side, but of course you could have an isolated queen pawn with the black pieces. It's not color dependent. You might say, well, what aren't there model games from the other side? Like, am I suggesting that the side with the IQP wins more games? Again, not necessarily. I'm just taking the IQP side for a bit. I can give you just as interesting of instructive games from the other side. And the one game that comes to mind is Karpov-Korchnoi. This is considered to be a model game for fighting against the isolated queen pawn. Let me see if I can hunt it down really quickly. Yeah, Karpov actually won that game. So I've shown this game before on my stream and like other speedruns and stuff. This was Korchnoi-Karpov during their World Championship match in 1981. 4 years after their really famous World Championship match in Baguio City, the controversial. And this was a Queen's Gambit declined. So here we got the isolated queen pawn structure. And the way Karpov won is just by exchanging all of the pieces. He exchanged all of the pieces, and the more exchanges that happen, the less possible it is for the side with the isolated queen pawn to generate attacking ideas. And so oftentimes the more significant the weak pawn becomes. Karpov plays knight h5, just trading bishops. Pretty soon after he trades knights, Korchnoi offers the trade himself. More trades happen. And Korchnoi just kind of stumbles into this really, really bad position. Now he's got no attacking chances, and he is still saddled with this weak pawn. And notice how Karpov has completely blockaded the square in front of the pawn. He's not permitting d5 at all. Pretty soon after, he triples on the d-file and he wins the game. Eventually, Korchnoi succumbs and he trades the last pair of minor pieces, and Karpov eventually wins. It's very instructive to see how he does it, but we're not going to bog ourselves down to this right now. He wins the game. Can I show this from Black's point of view? I could, but that's not really the point. We're not going to sit down and analyze this game for 30 minutes, although we could. What I'm trying to show is that it's not like the side with the isolated queen pawn wins more games, or it's more fun to play with the IQP. The side that plays against it can also score some very instructive points. And if you're playing against the isolated queen pawn, your checklist involves blockading the square in front of the pawn. And if you can orchestrate trades, particularly if you can trade queens, that benefits you. If you can trade your knight for the light squared bishop, that's often a favorable trade as well. That's actually what we tried to do during the game. So back to the game, White played knight e4. Pretty bad move because it doesn't do anything. It doesn't prevent us from completing our development. Now knight g5, h6, wasting more time. Our opponent goes back and just gives us like 3 extra tempi. I'm actually curious if I played this correctly. I'm going to run this on the engine. Knight e4, bishop e7. Already black is better. Rook e1, rook c8 is correct. Knight g3. Knight b4 is liked by the engine. And after bishop e1, queen c7 is already +2. So already here, white is losing. The only move that kept white in the game was bishop to e4. All right, so you had to abandon your hopes of a battery and just say, okay, I'm at least going to keep the bishop on a more active position. Yeah, so bishop e4 kept white in the game. Yeah, so bishop e4, if black goes queen c7 here, which we would have, here white can play bishop to d2. This is a move that white didn't have in the game, and if we play knight c2, white has rook c1. So this was the way for white to stay in the game. Now, what should black do? What should black do in this position? You might say, oh, black has already blundered. But no, in fact, this is the correct line. How does black get a stable advantage here? Yeah, knight takes c1. So you actually give up the queen, but you get 2 rooks for it. Now you play knight takes f3 check, queen takes f3, rook takes c7, and black is better. The 2 rooks are slightly better than the queen, but white retains some attacking chances. White retains... The game goes on, essentially. So the engine top move is h4 here, which is a really hard move to make. Not really sure what the point is. f5, bishop d3, and the game goes on. White is surviving. In the game, if white tries to do the same thing, well, obviously you can't because the rooks don't jump over bishops. So after bishop e1, queen c7, I think the game is essentially over. The only move, I think, was rook e2. This was white's last chance. And here the computer line is very instructive. You start with bishop a6, forcing rook d2. Now black has an excellent move. Who can tell me what it is? Actually, 2 excellent moves. Both of them are aimed at the same thing. And logical thinking will lead you to the right move here. Yep, idle CS gets one of them. King to h8 is one of the 2 moves. Now you're simply expanding the threat to the bishop. Why was queen takes c1 not possible? It was because of this discover check. What is the root of the discover check? Well, we can take away the root of it, or we can cut off the diagonal. Even better is to play f5, because here we also take away the e4 square from white's bishop, so the bishop on c1 is literally trapped. The only move for white is a3. You have to counterattack a piece. Queen c1, a b4, bishop b4, and black is just crushing in this position. Black is just crushing. Because if you play rook takes bishop, black obviously plays bishop takes rook, and white's collapsing. The computer kind of stays in the game, but this is not very good. Okay, knight h5, knight c2 is just game over. Bishop takes h6, desperation. If I was playing white, I mean, I would just bite the bullet and go into this endgame. As nasty as it is, at least white can keep defending. But I mean, who would want to be in this? Who would want to suffer in an endgame like this? According to the computer, it's -2, -2.5. But I think in human terms, this is even more nasty. This is just lost. My pieces are getting in. Classic example of a position that the computer can probably save. But if you have this with white, you just hate your life. You're just miserable. Okay. So in the game, bishop h6, gh, and then the final test, right, was this position after queen d2. But the interesting thing is that there are, according to the computer, there are 4 moves that keep a decisive advantage. We played the best move, knight takes c1. This wins immediately. Bishop g5 is also winning, as I mentioned in the game. This is probably also winning, but it's significantly more messy. What are the other winning moves here? The other winning move is knight f6, which is a very engine-like move, allowing queen h6, and actually going after the knight. So you can take away the knight on h5, and the knight on c2 takes away the bishop, so black is winning. And the last winning move is knight f4. This is just pure computer chess. This did not occur to me at all. Knight takes f4, knight takes e1. It's also the least convincing win, because white can recapture on e1, and here black is only up in exchange. Black is still winning, but, you know, some work remains to be done. But if you find the most accurate win at the very start, you often eliminate all resistance. Knight takes e1. If white would have played knight takes e1, in the game, our opponent just lost immediately. What would have been our response here? Black to play. What is the most clinical way to end the game? Yeah, bishop g5. Bishop g5 now ends the game. Very easy move. White can threaten checkmate, but it'll be the last time that white threatens checkmate this game, because we just push f5. That's it. We are up a rook. There is no attack. White can resign. And white can't even get the bishop out, because we now jump to b4 with the other knight. So in this game, you can see how quickly, like if white doesn't do anything, and that's literally our opponent just went back and forth, black lays on the pressure very quickly. Once you complete your development as black and you get your heavy pieces to good squares, white has to generate activity. Otherwise, you're going to get massacred. And that's what happened in this game. So hopefully this was a decent overview of typical IQP plans. Of course, I barely scratched the surface. There's a million more games I could show, but it's getting late. And I think that's good enough for one video. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed. Good game to my opponent. Yeah, we keep our climb going to 2,400. See you guys later.